The year is 2018. The International Monetary Fund releases its annual report on Latin America. Chile is, once again, the star student. GDP per capita, highest in the region. Poverty rate, lowest in decades. Inflation, stable. Debt to GDP ratio, the envy of Europe. Credit rating, investment grade. The economy has grown for 30 consecutive years. Foreign investors can't get enough. The Economist calls Chile Latin America's success story. The World Bank praises its pension system as a model for developing nations. Presidents from around the world visit Santiago to learn the secret formula. 1 year later, Chile is on fire. October 2019, over 1 million people flood the streets of Santiago in the largest protests in Chilean history. Metro stations burn. The military deploys for the first time since the dictatorship. A state of emergency is declared. Curfews, tear gas, chaos. How do you go from model economy to social explosion in 12 months? Here's the answer that nobody wants to hear. You don't. Chile didn't explode suddenly. The bomb had been ticking for decades. The economists just couldn't hear it because it wasn't in their spreadsheets. This is the story of the economy that did everything right and still failed. The model that worked on paper and collapsed on the street. This is what happens when the numbers are perfect, but the people are broken. 1. The Chicago Boys, the experiment begins. To understand Chile's explosion, you need to understand Chile's experiment, and that experiment began in blood. The 11th of September 1973, General Augusto Pinochet overthrows Salvador Allende, the democratically elected socialist president, in a military coup backed by the CIA. Allende dies in the presidential palace. Thousands of leftists are rounded up, tortured, and killed. Pinochet's regime was a nightmare of human rights abuses, but it was also a laboratory. Because Pinochet had a problem, the economy was in chaos after Allende's socialist policies, and military generals don't typically know how to fix inflation. So Pinochet outsourced economic policy to a group of Chilean economists who had studied at the University of Chicago under Milton Friedman. They were called Los Chicago Boys. Their prescription was radical: free markets, privatization, deregulation, and minimal government intervention. Chile would become the purest experiment in neoliberal economics the world had ever seen. The Chicago Boys didn't just adjust policy, they rebuilt the economy from scratch. They privatized over 400 state-owned companies. They eliminated price controls. They opened the economy to foreign trade and investment. They crushed unions. They cut government spending ruthlessly. And in 1980, they did something unprecedented. They privatized the entire pension system. Instead of a government-managed retirement fund, every Chilean worker would now have an individual savings account managed by private companies called AFPs. Your retirement would depend not on collective security, but on your personal investment returns. The Chicago Boys believed they were building a machine, a perfect economic machine where markets would allocate resources efficiently, competition would drive innovation, and individual responsibility would replace collective dependence. And for a while, it seemed to work. 2. The miracle. The numbers that dazzled the world. Let's give credit where it's due. Chile's economic transformation produced real results. In 1975, Chile's GDP per capita was around $1,300. By 2018, it was over $16,000. That's not statistical noise. That's a 12-fold increase in living standards in a single generation. Poverty fell dramatically. In 1990, when democracy returned, nearly 40% of Chileans lived in poverty. By 2017, that number was under 10%. Tens of millions of people moved into the middle class. Chile developed export industries beyond copper: wine, salmon, fruit, forestry products. The economy diversified. Trade deals were signed with virtually every major economy on Earth. Inflation, which had hit 500% under Allende, was tamed to low single digits. The currency stabilized. Foreign investment poured in. The pension system, despite its critics, accumulated assets worth over 70% of GDP. Chilean capital markets became the deepest in Latin America. The Santiago Stock Exchange was a real market, not a casino. International institutions loved Chile because it followed the rules. It didn't default on debt. It didn't nationalize foreign companies. It didn't print money to finance populist giveaways. It was predictable. By the 2010 seconds, Chile was on the verge of something no Latin American country had achieved: escaping the middle income trap. The path to developed, nation status seemed clear. So what went wrong? 3. The pension time bomb. Let's start with the system that symbolized the Chilean model, the private pension funds. Remember that radical experiment from 1980? Individual retirement accounts managed by private companies? After 40 years, the results were in. And they were devastating. By 2019, the average pension in Chile was around $300 per month. The minimum wage was $450. Basic expenses in Santiago, a city with first world prices, ate through that almost immediately. Half of all Chilean retirees received pensions below the poverty line. How did this happen? The system was supposed to work, the math was supposed to add up. Here's what the Chicago boys didn't model: real life. They assumed workers would contribute consistently for 40 years. But in Chile, like everywhere, people have gaps in employment. Women leave the workforce to raise children. Workers spend years in informal jobs that don't contribute to the system. The average Chilean worker only contributes for about half their working life. They assumed investment returns would be consistently high, but managing money for 40 years means weathering multiple crises: the Asian financial crisis, the 2008 collapse. Fees charged by private administrators ate into returns year after year. They assumed wages would grow steadily, but Chilean wages stagnated for most workers while the cost of living, especially in Santiago, approached European levels. The result: a generation of Chileans who worked their entire lives, did everything the system asked of them, and ended up with pensions that couldn't cover rent. The private pension system became the single most hated institution in Chile. Polls showed over 90% of Chileans wanted fundamental reform. No Más AFP became a rallying cry that transcended political divisions. 4. The inequality machine. The pension crisis was a symptom of a deeper disease: inequality. Chile's Gini coefficient, the standard measure of income inequality, remained stubbornly high throughout the miracle years. Among OECD countries, only Mexico was more unequal, but the statistics don't capture the lived experience. In Santiago, you could drive from Las Condes, a neighborhood of gleaming towers and European boutiques, to La Pintana, where families lived in houses smaller than Las Condes parking spaces, in 30 minutes. Same city, different planets. The wealthy sent their children to private schools that rivaled anything in Europe. The poor sent theirs to crumbling public schools where teachers earned poverty wages. University education, the ticket to the middle class, was among the most expensive in the world relative to income. Healthcare was similarly divided. The rich had private clinics with first world care. The poor waited months for appointments in an underfunded public system. When you got sick in Chile, your prognosis depended heavily on your income. The Chicago boys had argued that growth would lift all boats, and technically, it did. Poverty fell, living standards rose, but the boats at the top rose so much faster that the gap became a chasm. Chile had created a first world economy with third world distribution. 5. The 30 peso spark. The 6th of October 2019, the Santiago Metro announces a fare increase. 30 pesos, about 4 cents. It seems trivial. In the context of a functioning economy with low inflation and strong growth, what's 4 cents? But the 4 cents landed on 40 years of accumulated pressure. High school students began jumping the turnstiles in protest. Evade, they called it. The fare evasion spread. Within days, it wasn't about the metro fare anymore. It was about everything. The pensions that couldn't cover rent, the hospital waits, the school fees, the electricity bills that kept rising, the water that was privatized and expensive, the sense that the system was rigged, that no matter how hard you worked, you'd never get ahead. "It's not 30 pesos, it's 30 years, became the slogan that captured it all. On October 18, Santiago erupted. Metro stations were set on fire. Over 20 stations were severely damaged or destroyed. The government declared a state of emergency. Soldiers appeared on the streets for the first time since Pinochet. But the protests didn't stop. They grew. On October 25, over 1.2 million people marched in Santiago. In a metropolitan area of 7 million, that's 1 in 6 residents. It was the largest demonstration in Chilean history. And they weren't demanding revolution. They weren't waving red flags or calling for socialism. They were demanding dignity, a word that appeared on sign after sign: dignidad. The perfect economy had produced a dignity deficit that no spreadsheet could measure. 6. The violence question. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable for everyone. The protests weren't entirely peaceful. Metro infrastructure was destroyed. Supermarkets were looted. churches were burned, property damage ran into the billions. But the state response was also violent. Amnesty International documented systematic human rights abuses by Chilean security forces. Over 350 people suffered serious eye injuries from rubber bullets and tear gas canisters. Thousands were detained. Credible allegations of torture emerged. Both sides have their narratives. Conservatives point to the destruction and argue that legitimate grievances were hijacked by radical elements. They see the protests as the breakdown of law and order, an attack on the institutions that built Chilean prosperity. Progressives point to the state violence and argue that decades of peaceful protest had achieved nothing. They see the explosion as an inevitable response to a system that ignored democratic demands for reform. The truth is probably that both dynamics were real. Long suppressed anger found expression in ways that included both legitimate protest and criminal opportunism. The state, caught off guard, responded with both reasonable crowd control and indefensible brutality. What's undeniable is that the social contract had broken. The implicit deal, you work hard within the system and the system rewards you, no longer felt true for millions of Chileans. And when the social contract breaks, things get ugly. 7. The Constitution. Question. The protests eventually channeled into a political demand, a new constitution. This was logical. Chile's existing constitution dated from 1980, written under Pinochet, designed by the Chicago Boys. It had been amended many times, but its DNA remained authoritarian and market fundamentalist. The Constitution made it nearly impossible to reform the pension system. It enshrined water rights as private property. It limited the state's ability to provide public services. The system that Chileans hated was constitutionally protected. In October 2020, Chileans voted overwhelmingly, 78% to 22%, to write a new constitution through an elected convention. It felt like a democratic triumph. The people would finally redesign the system. What followed was a disaster of a different kind. The Constitutional Convention, elected in 2021, swung hard to the left. It included indigenous representatives, environmentalists, feminists, and independents who had never held office. They wrote a constitution that was progressive, ambitious, and radical. Too radical for most Chileans. The proposed constitution included rights to housing, healthcare, and education. It recognized indigenous nations with territorial autonomy. It restructured the political system. It was 178 pages of transformative vision. In September 2022, Chileans rejected it by 62% to 38%. The country that had exploded against the neoliberal model also rejected the progressive alternative. They were stuck between a past they hated and a future they feared. 8. The second attempt. Chile tried again. A new constitutional process began in 2023, this time with a convention that swung right. The new draft was shorter, more conservative, less transformative. In December 2023, Chileans rejected it too, by 56% to 44%. Two constitutional processes, two rejections, the country couldn't agree on what it wanted to become. This is the deeper crisis beneath the economic crisis. Chile had lost its story. The old narrative that the market model would deliver prosperity for all had collapsed in October 2019. But no new narrative had taken its place. President Gabriel Boric, elected in 2021 as the youngest leader in Chilean history on a wave of progressive hope, found himself governing a divided country with a constitution he couldn't change, an economy he couldn't transform, and expectations he couldn't meet. The model had failed. But what would replace it? 9. The lesson of Chile. Here's what the Chilean collapse teaches us about economics. Numbers can lie, or rather, numbers can tell the truth while missing the point entirely. Chile's GDP growth was real. Its poverty reduction was real. Its macroeconomic stability was real. Every metric that economists measure said the model was working. But the metrics don't measure dignity. They don't measure whether a 70-year-old who worked her whole life can afford medicine. They don't measure whether a young person believes hard work will lead to a better life. They don't measure the psychic weight of inequality, of seeing wealth you can never access, of knowing the game is rigged. The Chicago Boys built a machine that optimized for efficiency. They forgot that economies exist to serve people, not the other way around. This isn't an argument against markets or growth or fiscal responsibility. Chile needed all of those things after the chaos of the Allende years. The reforms produced real benefits for real people. But somewhere along the way, the reforms became ideology. The model became religion. and the priests of the model stopped listening to the congregation. When people complained about pensions, they were told the system worked. When people complained about healthcare, they were told to buy private insurance. When people complained about education, they were told to take out loans. The answer was always, the market will provide. Trust the model. The model was trusted for 40 years, and then, in one explosive month, it wasn't. 10. The future unwritten. Where is Chile now? Economically, the country remains stable but stagnant. Growth has slowed, investment has declined, the uncertainty of the constitutional processes scared capital away. Politically, the country is fragmented. Neither the left nor the right commands a majority. The center has collapsed. Coalition building is agonizing. Socially, the wounds of 2019 haven't healed. The protesters who lost eyes to police rubber bullets haven't forgotten. The business owners whose shops were looted haven't forgotten. The divisions are deep, but Chile has something many countries lack: institutional resilience. The protests didn't topple the government. The constitutional processes, though failed, were peaceful democratic exercises. The military stayed in barracks. Power transferred normally. The question is whether Chile can find a new model that preserves what worked: the openness, the fiscal discipline, the integration with the world economy, while fixing what failed: the inequality, the inadequate pensions, the underinvested public services. This isn't impossible. Nordic countries combine market economies with strong social safety nets, but they built those systems over generations with broad social consensus. Chile has to build something similar in a context of deep polarization and distrust. Conclusion: when the model breaks, the Chilean story is a warning to the world. It's a warning to economists who worship metrics without asking what the metrics miss. Growth is not enough. Stability is not enough. Even poverty reduction is not enough if it comes with a system that people experience as unjust. It's a warning to policymakers who believe ideology can substitute for pragmatism. The free market is a powerful tool, but it's a tool, not a god. When you treat it as infallible, you stop seeing its failures until they explode in your face. It's a warning to elites who think they can forever ignore popular discontent. Chile's rich assumed the model would protect them. They assumed that strong growth and low inflation would immunize them from political backlash. They were wrong. And it's a warning to protesters who think destruction can substitute for construction. Chile rejected the old constitution. It also rejected the new one. Breaking the system is easier than building something better. The model that was supposed to be perfect wasn't, but the alternative hasn't been found yet. Chile is still searching. The economy that did everything right is still trying to figure out what it did wrong. The numbers are still strong. The people are still angry. The future is still unwritten. And somewhere in Santiago, an economist is looking at a spreadsheet showing stable inflation and positive growth and wondering why none of it seems to matter. The numbers are perfect, the country is broken, and that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all. If this analysis made you think differently about economic success, hit that subscribe button. Because the Chilean question, how do you build an economy that works for everyone, isn't just Chile's question, it's the question of our time. See you in the comments. And remember, economics isn't just about numbers, it's about people, and people don't live in spreadsheets.